Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled people story. What would you do if a complete stranger sent you a bill for $100 and then stole your property when you refused to pay? This isn't a story about a random thief. It's about an HOA president who thought she was the queen of the neighborhood. She thought she'd won, but she was actually walking straight into a trap. Want to see how I broke her? I bought my house 2 years ago in what I thought was the perfect suburban neighborhood. The development had been built in 2 phases, and I specifically chose a house in the first phase because when I was doing my research during the home buying process, I found out that phase 1 had been completed before any HOA was ever established. The developer's original plans for an HOA covering the whole community fell through, and my deed and title insurance made absolutely no mention of any HOA membership or covenants. That was actually one of the main reasons I pulled the trigger on the purchase. I had lived under an HOA before in my previous condo, and I was done with that nonsense. Life was good for those 2 years. I had a nice 3-bedroom house with a small yard, friendly neighbors who mostly kept to themselves, and zero drama. I could park my car wherever I wanted on my own driveway, paint my front door any color I felt like, and generally just live my life without someone breathing down my neck about community standards. It was peaceful, quiet. Exactly what I wanted after years of apartment living and then that condo with the nightmare HOA board. Then phase 2 got built. A different company took over the remaining land and put up another 50 houses or so. Those residents formed their own HOA, which was fine by me. Their business, not mine. I figured they could do whatever they wanted over there, and I would continue doing whatever I wanted over here. The 2 phases were pretty clearly separated by the road layout anyway. The whole thing started on a Saturday morning in late spring. I was sitting on my front porch with my coffee, enjoying the weather and feeling pretty good about life in general. The birds were doing their thing, the sun was out, and I was thinking about maybe grilling some burgers later. Then I saw the mail carrier drop something in my mailbox that looked thicker than usual. I walked over and pulled out what looked like an official letter. It had this fancy header that said Phase 2 HOA, and underneath that was my address. My first thought was that someone had mixed up the mail, but nope, my address was right there in the Dear Resident line. It was a violation notice. Apparently I was guilty of improper storage of waste containers. According to this letter, trash and recycling cans could not be visible from the street except for a 12-hour window on collection day. The letter stated that my cans were clearly visible from the road, and this was my first official warning. I actually laughed out loud. My trash cans were tucked on the side of my house behind a bush. You could maybe see a corner of one if you really looked, but they were hardly some eyesore. More importantly, though, I knew for a fact that I was not in their HOA. I went inside and dug out my closing documents. I spent the next hour going through every page of my deed, my title insurance policy, my disclosure documents, everything. Not a single mention of any HOA anywhere. I even pulled up the plat map for the development and confirmed that my lot was clearly in Phase 1, which had no HOA jurisdiction. So I figured this was just a simple mistake. Someone probably had the wrong address in their system. I decided to be polite about it and just send them a quick email to clear things up. The violation notice had an email address at the bottom for correspondence. I typed out a nice professional message explaining that I believed the notice was sent in error because my property was in Phase 1 and not legally part of their HOA. I asked them to please update their records and remove my address. Hit send. Done. I figured that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. About 3 days later, I got a reply. The email came from someone who signed herself as the HOA president. Her response was short and dismissive. She wrote that all homes in the community were expected to follow the bylaws for everyone's property values. The rule was clear, and I needed to make sure my waste containers were stored out of sight. She added that further violations would result in fines. I read that email 3 times. She had completely ignored my main point. She did not acknowledge anything about Phase 1 versus Phase 2. She did not say there had been a mistake. She just doubled down on the rule and threatened me with fines. That was when I realized this was not a clerical error. This woman either did not care that I was not in her HOA, or she genuinely believed she had authority over properties that were not under her jurisdiction. Either way, I needed to be more direct. I spent that evening putting together a more detailed response. I attached a PDF of my property plat map with my lot highlighted. I also attached a section of my title insurance policy that clearly showed no HOA encumbrance on my property. In the email, I politely but firmly explained again that my property was not legally bound by their HOA. I stated that any attempt to levy fines against me would be considered harassment, and I asked her to confirm in writing that she had received my documentation and would be correcting their records. I sent that email off and waited. Days went by, a week, 2 weeks, nothing. No response at all. Then another letter showed up in my mailbox. This one was a second violation notice, and it came with a $50 fine. The letter said I had failed to correct the issue and now owed the HOA $50 payable within 14 days. I was annoyed, but I was not worried. The fine was completely illegitimate. They had no legal standing to fine me for anything. I tossed the letter in a folder with all my other documentation and went about my life. I was not going to pay them a single cent. 2 more weeks passed. Then came the final notice. The fine had jumped to $100 now. The letter had this stern warning about how failure to comply and pay would result in further enforcement action, including the removal of non-compliant items at the homeowner's expense. I remember reading that line and thinking it was almost funny. What were they going to do, come steal my trash cans? That would be theft. But I still was not too concerned. These people were clearly on some kind of power trip, but I figured they would eventually realize I was not going to bend and they would move on to harass someone else. I was wrong about that too. It happened on a Thursday. Trash day. I put my cans out at the curb that morning like I always did. I went to work, came home around 6 in the evening, and the cans were gone. Both of them. The garbage truck had already come through because I could see everyone else's empty cans sitting at their curbs. Mine were just gone. I stood there looking at the empty spot on the curb where my cans should have been. My first thought was that maybe the garbage truck had accidentally taken them, but that did not make sense. Those trucks have automated arms. They dump the trash and put the cans back. They do not drive away with the actual cans. I was standing there trying to figure out what had happened when my neighbor from across the street came walking over. He was an older guy, maybe in his 60s, who lived in another Phase 1 house. We had talked a few times over the years. Nice enough guy. He had his dog with him on a leash. He called out to me and asked if I was looking for my trash cans. I said, yeah, they seem to have disappeared. That was when he told me something that made my blood pressure spike. He said he had seen something strange earlier that afternoon. About an hour after the garbage truck went through, he saw a pickup truck pull up. A big guy got out, and he and another person loaded my trash cans into the truck bed and drove off. My neighbor said he thought it was weird, so he wrote down the license plate number just in case I needed it later. He handed me a scrap of paper with the plate number on it. I asked him if he recognized the guy who took the cans. He said, yeah, he was pretty sure it was the vice president of the Phase 2 HOA. Big guy, always driving around in that pickup truck looking all self-important. I thanked my neighbor about 5 times. That license plate number was going to be crucial. I went back inside and immediately called the HOA office number. The president answered. I kept my voice calm and polite. I told her who I was and said my garbage cans had gone missing from my property. I asked if she knew anything about it. The way she responded told me everything I needed to know. Her voice had this smug, satisfied tone. She said yes, as per the final notice I had received, my non-compliant items had been removed as part of their community enforcement action. She added that I would be receiving a bill for the removal service and disposal fee shortly. I wanted to make absolutely sure I understood what she was saying. I asked her directly if she was admitting that she or someone acting on her behalf had come onto my property and taken my personal belongings. She said they were enforcing the community bylaws, which I had chosen to ignore. Then she told me to have a nice day and hung up. I sat there for a minute just processing what had happened. This woman had just admitted to theft. She had called it enforcement, but that did not change the facts. Someone acting on behalf of their HOA had come to my property and stolen my trash cans, and she had just confessed to it over the phone. I did not get angry. I got methodical. I grabbed a notebook and started writing down everything I needed to do. This was going to require documentation, evidence, and following proper procedures. Getting emotional would not help. What would help was treating this like the crime it actually was. First thing I did was call the non-emergency police line. When the dispatcher answered, I calmly stated that I needed to file a report for theft. She asked me what was stolen. and I told her 2 heavy-duty waste containers with a total value of about $150. She asked when it happened, and I gave her the time frame. Then I told her I had a witness who had seen the perpetrator take the items, and I had the license plate number of the vehicle used. That got her attention. She said she would send an officer over to take a full statement. About 40 minutes later, a police officer showed up at my door. He was professional and thorough. I walked him through the whole timeline. I showed him all the letters from the HOA. I gave him my neighbor's name as the witness. I provided the license plate number. And then I told him about the phone call with the HOA president where she had admitted that they were responsible for removing my property. The officer wrote everything down. He said this was pretty cut and dry theft, regardless of what the HOA wanted to call it. He gave me a case number and said they would follow up with the individuals involved. He also suggested I might want to send the HOA a formal demand letter for the return of my property or compensation. After he left, I spent the rest of the evening drafting that letter. This needed to be perfect. I was not just asking nicely anymore, I was drawing a line in the sand and making it clear exactly what would happen if they did not comply. I laid out the facts. On such and such date, 2 waste containers that were my private property were stolen from my home. The replacement value was $150. I had a witness who identified their vice president removing the items in his personal vehicle, and I had his license plate number. Their president had confessed to ordering this action in a phone call. I had filed a police report with a case number. Then I explained very clearly that my property was not part of their HOA. I had notified them of this fact in writing on 2 separate occasions. Their actions therefore constituted theft of private property. Here was my demand. They had 72 hours from receipt of this letter to deliver a certified check for $165. That was $150 for the cans and $15 for the cost of sending this certified letter. They also needed to deliver a formal written apology signed by the board, a confirmation that my property was not and would never be under their jurisdiction, and a confirmation that all their fake fines were void and my address had been permanently removed from their records. If they failed to meet these demands within 72 hours, I would immediately file a lawsuit in small claims court for the property value, legal fees, and punitive damages. I would also provide all my evidence, including the confession, to the district attorney to pursue criminal charges against the individuals involved. I printed the letter, made copies of everything, and took it all to the post office the next morning. I sent it certified mail with return receipt requested to the HOA's registered address. Now it was just a matter of waiting. The return receipt came back 3 days later. Someone had signed for the letter. I could picture the president opening that envelope and reading my demands. I wondered if she was still feeling smug. I did not have to wonder for long. 2 days after that, on a Tuesday afternoon, there was a knock on my door. It was a courier service. He handed me a large envelope and had me sign for it. I opened it right there on my front porch. Inside was a certified check made out to me for $165. There was also a letter on HOA stationery, but the tone was completely different from anything they had sent me before. The letter was formal and apologetic. It acknowledged that my property at my address was not part of their HOA and never had been. It stated that all previous violation notices and fines were void, and my address had been permanently removed from their records. It included an apology for the removal of my property and any inconvenience caused. The letter was signed by what looked like 3 different board members. There was no mention of enforcement or bylaws or community standards, just a straightforward acknowledgement that they had messed up and they were making it right. I stood there holding that check and that letter, feeling this wave of satisfaction wash over me. These people had thought they could bully me into compliance. They had stolen my property and called it enforcement. They had ignored my documentation and my attempts to communicate. And now, faced with actual legal consequences and a police report with their names on it, they had completely folded within 48 hours of receiving my certified letter. The thing that struck me most was how fast they caved. All that bluster and attitude from the president on the phone. All that smugness when she told me they had removed my non-compliant items. Gone. Replaced with a formal apology and a check that covered every penny I had demanded. I walked back inside and called my neighbor who had witnessed the whole thing. I told him what had happened and thanked him again for getting that license plate number. He said he was glad it worked out, and he mentioned that he had actually been dealing with some annoying letters from the HOA himself, even though he was also in Phase 1. He asked if I would mind if he used my approach if they kept bothering him. I told him absolutely, and I even offered to send him copies of my documentation as a template. We talked for a bit about how the HOA had clearly been overstepping their boundaries and trying to assert authority over properties they had no legal claim to. He said he knew of at least 2 other Phase 1 homeowners who had gotten violation notices in the past few months. It seemed like the HOA had decided they were going to run the whole neighborhood regardless of what the actual legal boundaries were. That conversation got me thinking. This was not just about my trash cans anymore. This was about the HOA operating under the assumption that they could push people around, and most people would just comply rather than fight back. They were counting on people not knowing their rights or not wanting to deal with the hassle of pushing back. Well, they had picked the wrong person to mess with. And now I had a decision to make about what to do next. I looked at that check again. $165. They had paid exactly what I demanded. No negotiation, no pushback. That told me they knew they were in the wrong and they were trying to make this go away as quietly as possible. The apology letter was clearly written by someone, probably their lawyer, who understood they had committed theft and they needed to do damage control. But was that enough? They had returned the value of my property and apologized. They had confirmed in writing that I was not part of their HOA. My address was supposedly purged from their records. On paper, I had gotten everything I asked for. The question was whether I wanted to let this end here or whether I wanted to make sure this never happened to anyone else in Phase 1. Because I was pretty sure that if I just took my check and moved on, the HOA would wait a few months and then start the same nonsense with other Phase 1 residents. They would be more careful maybe, but they would keep trying to expand their authority beyond their legal boundaries. I spent that whole evening thinking about it. Part of me just wanted to be done with the whole situation. I had won, I had my money, I had my apology. I could take that check to the bank, buy new trash cans, and go back to my peaceful life. But another part of me was really annoyed by the principle of the thing. These people had not just made a mistake, they had deliberately ignored my clear communication that I was not in their HOA. They had escalated to threatening fines, and then they had actually committed theft. If my neighbor had not seen it happen and written down that license plate, and if the president had not been dumb enough to confess on the phone, they might have gotten away with it. How many other people had they done this to? How many residents had just paid the fines because they did not want the hassle? How many people had complied with rules they were not actually bound by because they assumed the HOA must have authority? I pulled out my laptop and started doing some research. I looked up the HOA's corporate registration and found the names of all the board members. I looked up property records and confirmed which lots were actually part of Phase 2. I made a map showing the clear distinction between Phase 1 and Phase 2. Then I started looking into whether there were any legal precedents for HOAs trying to enforce rules outside their jurisdiction. Turns out this was not as uncommon as I thought. There were cases all over the country of HOAs overstepping their boundaries and trying to control properties they had no legal claim to. I found one case where an HOA had tried to fine a homeowner who was not a member, and when the homeowner fought back, the HOA ended up having to pay significant damages for harassment and attempted extortion. That was interesting. I also found information about how to file complaints against HOAs with the state regulatory board. Apparently, HOAs are corporations and they have to follow certain rules about how they operate. Stealing property and trying to enforce rules on non-members seemed like it might violate some of those rules. The more I dug into it, the more I realized that taking the check and walking away might not actually solve the underlying problem. The HOA board members who had done this were still in power. They had not faced any real consequences beyond having to give me back the value of what they stole. There was nothing stopping them from doing the exact same thing to someone else. I looked at that check sitting on my kitchen table. $165. It felt like hush money, like they were hoping I would just take it and shut up and go away. That thought made me angry all over again. These people had come onto my property, stolen my belongings, tried to extort money from me with fake fines, and now they thought they could make it all go away with a check and a letter? I picked up my phone and called the police department. I asked to speak with the officer who had taken my original theft report. When he came on the line, I asked him what the status was of the investigation. He said they had contacted the vice president who had been identified as taking the cans, and the guy had admitted to it but claimed he was acting on behalf of the HOA board. The officer said it was a bit of a gray area legally since the guy was claiming it was civil enforcement rather than criminal theft. I asked what would happen next. The officer said that was really up to me. If I wanted to press charges, they could move forward with that. Or if I had resolved it civilly, which it sounded like I had based on the check and apology, I could close the report. I told him I needed some time to think about it and I would get back to him. He said that was fine and the report would stay open for now. After I hung up, I sat there thinking about my options. I could cash the check and close the police report and be done with it. Or I could keep pushing. I could refuse the settlement and actually take them to small claims court for punitive damages. I could file that complaint with the state regulatory board. I could even talk to a lawyer about whether there was a case for a more serious lawsuit. The thing was, I did not really want to become the person who spent the next year of their life fighting with an HOA. I had a job, I had a life. I did not want this to take over everything. But I also did not want to let them off the hook this easily. They needed to face real consequences, not just write a check and move on. Otherwise, they would learn nothing and they would keep doing this to other people. I decided to sleep on it. I put the check in my desk drawer and did not cash it. I wanted to sit with this decision for a bit and figure out what the right move was. The next morning, I was drinking my coffee on the front porch again when I saw something interesting. The HOA president drove past my house in her golf cart. When she saw me sitting there, she immediately turned and went down a different street. She looked uncomfortable, maybe even scared. That gave me an idea. I realized that the check and the apology letter were actually enough. Not because they had paid me fairly, but because I had already won something much more valuable than $165. I had won fear. These people were afraid of me now. They were afraid of what I might do next. They were afraid of the consequences of messing with someone who actually fought back. That fear would be more effective than any lawsuit or criminal charges. If I kept pushing, dragged this out in court, filed complaints with regulatory boards, I would just be spending my own time and energy. But if I accepted their surrender and then made sure they never forgot what happened, that would send a message that would last much longer. So I made my decision. I was going to cash the check. But I was also going to make sure that every time any of those board members looked at my property, they remembered exactly why they had written that check. I went to the bank that afternoon and deposited it. Then I drove to the hardware store and spent some time in the outdoor section. I found 2 absolutely beautiful trash cans. The expensive kind with heavy-duty construction, locking lids, smooth rolling wheels, the works. They cost me $130 for the pair. I loaded them into my car and drove home. I placed those shiny new cans in the exact same spot where the old ones had been, right there on the side of my house, partially visible behind the bush. The same spot that had started this whole mess. I stood back and admired them for a minute. They looked great. But I was not done yet. I still had $35 left over from the settlement. I drove to a garden center across town and walked around until I found exactly what I was looking for. There, in the lawn ornament section, was the most ridiculous pink flamingo I had ever seen. It was bright plastic, tacky as hell, and completely visible from any angle. It was perfect. I bought it and brought it home. I planted it right next to my new trash cans. It stood there in all its gaudy glory, impossible to miss. Over the next few weeks, I watched the neighborhood dynamics change. The HOA president's golf cart stopped coming down my street entirely. I saw her a few times from a distance, and she always found somewhere else to be when she spotted me. The vice president who had actually stolen my cans seemed to have developed a similar avoidance strategy. His truck would turn around if he saw me outside. My neighbor across the street came over one evening and told me something interesting. He said he had heard through some other neighbors that the HOA had become much less aggressive about enforcement lately. Apparently word had spread about what happened with my trash cans. Other Phase 1 residents who had been getting violation notices reported that the letters had stopped coming. The HOA seemed to have quietly backed off from trying to control properties outside their actual jurisdiction. That was exactly what I had hoped would happen. By standing up to them and documenting everything and following through with real consequences, I had not just solved my own problem. I had solved it for everyone else in Phase 1 too. I found out later from another neighbor that there had apparently been some kind of internal shakeup in the HOA board. A few members had resigned. There were rumors that their insurance company had gotten involved after learning about the theft incident and had told them they needed to be way more careful about what they classified as enforcement actions. All of that happened because I had refused to just comply and pay their fake fines. Because I had kept every document, filed the police report, sent the certified letter, and made it clear I would take this as far as it needed to go. The next one is a malicious compliance story. I used to work on the retentions department of an ISP back in the day. While many people called genuinely wanting to cancel their phone service, just as many knew that retentions was more than that. The ISP, let's call them Red Phone, had two different departments. I worked on retentions 1, where we did a lot of fixing bills and offering small discounts and slightly cheaper phones to customers who said they wanted to leave. Retentions 2 was for customers who were in the process of porting their numbers, and the worst thing they offered was a 50% discount for a couple of years with a decent phone for free. This happened roughly 10, maybe 12 years ago when roaming was straight up highway robbery. Let me introduce you to the executive. I got the call, I did my little introductory spiel, and I immediately discovered this guy was the most entitled POS I'd ever had the displeasure to speak to. He said he was a very important executive who traveled a lot for work, but the bill he got was ridiculous and I had to solve it or he was going to cancel his service. I muted him, so he heard nothing, but I could still hear what he said, and while I checked his account, I could hear him gloat to his girlfriend that he's getting the bill credited because he knows how to play the system. And he was an a-hole, but he wasn't wrong. This guy was a pro at playing Red Phone. He had the highest phone plan the company offered, which was around €90 at the time for one line, but paid €30 per month because he had discounts from both departments stacked on top of each other. His plan allowed him to get what at the time was a super expensive phone for basically nothing at Retentions 2. He'd gotten the super shiny customer status and the super shiny customer service line, which usually meant a customer was averaging a €300 monthly bill, despite his €30 ARPU because he complained about how the delocalized customer service sucked. He was also not wrong about his bill being ridiculous. He'd visited several EU countries, got a €600 bill, called customer service, and said he had not known that roaming was so expensive. No one had warned him when he told us he was traveling overseas. The company had a policy that the first time a customer complained about something, we could refund them, particularly if the complaint was that the customer had not been informed about extra charges. So the rep informed him about roaming costs and refunded him all of the roaming charges, leaving the bill at €30. Second month comes around, he kept using the phone overseas, got a €1,500 bill. He calls customer service, they tell him they can't refund him again. He says he wants to cancel his account then and gets transferred to me. He was demanding that we credited his roaming charges again because if we can do it once, we can do it again, and also because roaming prices were abusive. He did have a point there. I told him I couldn't do that, so he wanted me to open a claim and escalate it. I refused again because there was no one to escalate to. He wasn't going to get that credited. He insisted he wasn't hanging up until I escalated the issue because he wasn't informed, and if I kept the call going for much longer, he was going to charge the company for his time because he was a busy man. At this point, I'd been working there long enough that if you were nice or even normal, I would try my damnedest to help you, but if you were a diak, sorry, can't do, get lost. Customer refuses to hang up, I can hung up. This guy, though, he'd gone past being a diak into total Kent waffle. And I was pissed off. I couldn't be a dick back, but he'd been fucking around and I could make sure he found out. So I told him that okay, since he was so insistent, I would open a claim to refund him the €1,500 bill and muted him while I opened the claim. The a-hole was again gloating at his girlfriend about how clever he was because he was going to get this bill refunded too. Meanwhile, I was copy-pasting the notes from the previous month's claim where the rep had written, I've informed customer of roaming charges in all the countries he told me he could be visiting. List of European countries. Also, stacking discounts? Very much not a thing. He had to spam the Retentions 1 call centers with calls until he got a newbie lost enough to apply another discount over his Retentions 2 discount. And he had not read the terms and conditions of the accounts, but I had. Trying to defraud the company was grounds for service termination. I got the claim number, flagged down my supervisor, and told her to please send it to headquarters in the daily report so fraud could examine the account. I told the guy that the claim had been opened, but also that since it was obvious he was trying to abuse the company's policies, the claim had been flagged to be reviewed by fraud and it was likely his account would be terminated. He went from entitled to worried in 2 seconds and asked me to close the claim. Sorry dude, can't do, you wanted a claim open, now it's open. Yes, the customer was fired. The next one is an entitled people story. Nothing too crazy, but something that has stuck with me over the years. When I was 16, I took my GED. The process was detailed and the rules made clear. This group was for people seeking to take the whole exam at once, as opposed to taking a single subject portion at a time. Each subject was its own test. We had X amount of time to complete the section. At the end of that period, we got a break to stretch our legs or use the restroom. When filing back into the room, the tests were ready, placed upside down so you could only see the blank back of the paper. We were told not to turn our papers over and begin until time started, and we were instructed to do so. They said it at the start, and again before each section. After taking multiple sections and being there for hours, we were to begin the next portion of the exam. About half the people were back in the room from the break. One man, I would say maybe early 20s, sat down, turned his paper over, and started working. The two proctors in the room told him to stop, the timer hadn't started yet and the door was open, people filing in and out, etc. He ignored them. They said it again, he still kept going. One went up to him directly and said he needed to stop as there is a strict time limit per section. He looked up at her and yelled a string of profanity and said he had to get to work and didn't have time to wait around. They explained they couldn't allow it, he needed to stop, and if he proceeded they would have to cancel out the portion entirely. Again, he responded with an onslaught of indignation and profanity about how he didn't care what the rules were, he had to get to work by X time and he can't wait a few more minutes to start. The calm and patient proctor tried to help him, explaining that he would just need to wait a few minutes, take the test in accordance to the simple rules, and that he even had enough time to make a call to his work if needed. That was apparently an offensive offer. He was clear that he's a grown man. He didn't act like one, not some kid. You can't tell him there are rules he has to follow. So he was told this was his last warning. The rules are the rules and they apply to everyone equally. If he didn't stop, he would need to leave, and if he left, the entire test wouldn't be submitted and he would have wasted the whole thing, all those hours. He chose to leave. He angrily tossed his stuff into his bag while he yelled at them for being idiots and telling them to go duck themselves and duck off and duck you, and pretty much all the ducks. He then stormed out of the room, and about a minute later we started the test. To top us off, we were told the schedule for the day, what time each section starts, when it ends, how long the breaks were, down to the minute, from the start of the day, and before each new section. We were also told all of this when we had all gone to our registration meeting a couple weeks before the exam. We were all given a clear schedule of the day, breakdown of the time, and the simple rules that were imperative and needed to be followed. For example, you can't just flip your paper over early and start on it whenever you want. This guy absolutely knew all of this for weeks. Yet, he apparently thought he could take a shift at work during the same time as the exam because he could go through the test at his own leisure, when he wanted to start because he doesn't have to follow rules. The rules were clearly for everyone else. He should be able to do what he wanted, and when he finds out the rules apply to him too, he throws a tantrum, verbally abuses the very nice staff who are simply doing their job, and stubbornly threw away hours of work. It's not like he was surprised with the rules or schedule. It's not like he didn't agree to all of it. He just truly seemed to think he should be allowed to break the rules he didn't want to follow and punish anyone who tells him otherwise. The next one is an entitled parent story. My brother is a piece of crap parent with a drug addiction and is essentially happy to expose his son to violence and abusive that we insured so he can fund his coke addiction via my mum. As I don't agree with abusing children, I distanced myself many years ago. When they started damaging my belongings, like my car for example, I had to start making police reports, except my brother stopped me as his wife was pregnant. And the whole world apparently and all its problems now must vanish because they decided to bring a child into the world when he already had a drug addiction and mental health issues from the childhood abuse. I agreed and stayed silent, disappeared and moved cities. So he sends texts constantly asking for money or abusive texts mocking me for having fertility issues when his wife is pregnant. Great. Setting up the perfect relationship for your future child with his aunt. Eventually I had to go no contact as he enjoyed telling me how I deserved to have barren ovaries and crap. I didn't get an invite to the baby shower. I still got them a gift, but they forgot which one was mine. I was the last person to get a photo of him after he was born. My mum's work colleagues received an image first, yet I was supposed to be excited and didn't make an effort to appear so. I sent gifts that were never acknowledged, even tracked as they'd claimed they never arrived. but I still don't make an effort. He keeps banning me from seeing him and then unblocking me and sending 700 photos in a Google Drive folder telling me I'm missing out. Then he cancels on me when I arrange a visit whilst I'm halfway through a 3-hour drive back to my hometown. Now, most recently, they've banned me with legal action threats. I'm DBS checked for work, so I take this pretty seriously. I'm banned currently for asking for money back my brother spent on my cards and paying off one of his dealers. Social services are now involved due to his drug issues. He's blamed me for this now too because I have social workers taking care of me currently for an injury. He faked a well-being report call, and I'm the bad guy because my social worker and healthcare teams found out and now he could lose his son. Can someone please explain to me how people who are totally arseholes manage to assign parenthood as a right to bypass any consequences for being arseholes? Anyway, thank you for watching.